Well, welcome back to the Humans of Agriculture podcast. I'm joined by Matthew Evans. He's originally from Canberra. He's built a reputation as a food critic, a chef in Sydney before making the move to Tassie, where he and his partner Sadie established the Fat Pig Farm in the Huon Valley. Now, Matt, I'm going to say normally I come back and do the intros, but I think we will be able to cover what we're going to talk about here. So I saw you yesterday morning. I was getting ready for my day. You popped up on ABC News Brekkie, and I had spoken to Sue a couple of weeks ago. I got a copy of your book. The one job I was meant to do today was to bring the book because it would have been a really good prop. As soon as I saw it, I quickly messaged her, and by chance, we've managed to lock you down. So it's great to have you on this book launch week. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Mate, I guess for people who aren't familiar with you, you're a TV host, food critic, farmer. You love sharing your passion for all things food systems. And I think what we're going to cover today across what has now been 15 books, but really the last few, going from looking inside what's happening in the kitchen to looking inside food production and challenges of, I guess, of ethics and norms, and asking the questions of why do we grow the way we do? How have we come to be like this? It's a fascinating area. How did you come to land in this field? Was this just by chance?
Yeah, it's a lot by chance and a lot by greed, Ollie. I'm everything I've done has sort of been driven by gluttony. Like, I became a chef because I wanted to eat more and I wanted to eat better. And then I became a food critic. I used to review restaurants because I wanted to eat more and eat better. And then I thought I was eating in these restaurants, yet some of the home cooking I was having from other people, their ingredients seemed really cool. And I thought, wouldn't it be great to grow my own? So I thought, I could grow my own and eat really well. And then when we started growing food, I fell in love with that as a job, I guess, and went, wouldn't that be cool? And then, but all the time going, well, yeah, that's cool, good for me, like if I know how to cook. But wouldn't it be great if other people learn how to cook? Like growing up in Canberra when I was there, grew up, it wasn't great food. So, and my family were pommies, so they weren't necessarily very great cooks. My mum did a brilliant job, but 4 kids, not much money, Canberra. Yeah, she worked full time. And I was like, every time I discover something good, I'm like, I want to tell other people. So I guess I became a communicator in writing, and then we did this show on telly. And so I do, occasionally, things broadcast like this where you get to communicate the good things in life, I guess, which for me was food, and now it's the growing of food as well.
And I'm so interested because obviously you say the good things in life, like the topics and areas that you look at, whether it's a relationship with meat, not just, and I think that, as we'll probably explore with your book, it's not just what has happened here in Australia, it's taking a global look, but the relationship we've got with meat, the relationship we have with milk, like all these different foods, it can be incredibly polarising.
Yeah, and I think that's where I'm trying to, I guess, talk about these topics, because a lot of these topics get talked about, and I know your audience is going to be a lot of ag people, but a lot of, I deal with a lot of city people as well, and there's a lot of the conversations that involve agriculture where no one from agriculture is involved in the conversation. So there's lots of people sitting in an office in New York or London or, Melbourne or wherever, pontificating about how food is grown, and they grow nothing. And I'm like, well, hang on, there's people on the ground doing this, and it's more nuanced than just, let's just kill all the cows, or, let's just stop ploughing, or whatever the thing is that someone said, and it might look good on paper, their idea, and it might seem really great idealistically, but how does it look on the ground? And I guess I feel like I was in a good position to say, yeah, I'm a chef and I grew up in a town and I've never farmed till 16 years ago, but I'm trying to get a grip on, well, what does food production look like? How do we communicate the message of how food is produced to the people who are eating the food and the people who are maybe sometimes criticising us for the way we produce the food, and say, well, maybe there's a reason for it that you don't understand, or, yeah, you're right, maybe we could do better, because it can work both ways.
Totally. And I think for me, like what I find so interesting in it is it's not a one-way conversation, like just as the urban Australians should be involved in these conversations and can be involved in them. Like similarly, people on farms who can be incredibly disconnected from where the food actually ends up and the process it takes to get there. I think like that's where having these dialogues and conversations is really important, rather than just trying to tell a story. It's about sharing a conversation.
Yeah, and it is that polarisation that I find really hard, because 98% of Australians live in the middle, right? That's where they exist. They're not really anti anything or really, full on pro everything. They're just saying, well, I just want to, exist. I want to do well with my family. I don't want to harm the planet. I don't want to harm my family or my community. And so they're getting all these mixed messages, I guess, from the fringes. So these topics can be polarising, but I'm saying, well, okay, they're more nuanced. Let's have a chat about it. If you're grown-ups, you can make up your own mind about how you want to frame your diet, but don't demand everyone else has to do what you do, because they might have different motivations.
Yeah. And I think what's so interesting with food as well is, as an industry, which we come from a really strong place of research and facts and whatnot, but food's emotion.
Yeah, and that's And the thing with the most recent book, Milk. I wrote a book a couple of years, about 5 years ago. I put out a book, on eating meat, which is the ethics of eating meat, and I was sort of interested in some of the more intensive ways of producing meat, which I found, I'll be really honest, quite confronting. And then I went back into a space of writing on soil, which is really safe. It's safe for everybody. Everyone can sort of agree on soil biology and stuff like that. So it doesn't matter. Soil's very agnostic. It doesn't care whether you have animals and livestock and stuff like that. It just doesn't like to be damaged soil, really. And then I got back into the milk space and went, oh my God, like, people have got really strong opinions on this. I didn't realize how people have a lot of things to say about milk, not necessarily always based on facts, but based on emotion. Because milk, it's the first drink we have after we're born, and for all of us, it's something we drink throughout life when it comes from from cows or whatever, sheep or goats, and so it sort of taps into our culture and our psychology quite deeply, and which means that people have an opinion, rightly or wrongly.
Yeah. I was really wanting to ask you a question at the start. What is your coffee order?
My coffee order is a flat white in a tulip-shaped cup, which most cafes don't know what a tulip-shaped cup is, but like a small flat white, essentially. Yeah, and then people will be like, what nowadays might say, what's the milk? But that's, for me, it's by definition it's made with milk, because that's the tradition, and then anything else is a different thing. But I don't have the other milks. No.
You did talk about your last book on eating meat, and I would love to know, across all the different research that you've done, like what surprised you? What have you really learnt about the world and I guess the role of agriculture in it?
Oh, I think the biggest thing for me was that if you just read the mass media, there is this sense that farming and agriculture is just this kind of devastation that has this kind of disease that spread across the globe and damaged everything. And I guess really what I think of agriculture is potentially damaging, but it's also really potentially healing. And that's the big thing for me was, okay, so there's ways we can, every landscape on Earth has been altered by humans for a long time. Like Australia is 65,000 years and counting or whatever. Humans have changed the landscape. So so it's not like there's some kind of pristine wilderness that we have to go back to, or some kind of wildness that we're going to go back to by just taking everyone off the landscape or planting trees everywhere. So what does the future look like? Well, it looks like, let's grow nutrient-dense food, but let's say, okay, so we're losing a bit of biodiversity, so we've got to put that back. We've lost some of the forests. Maybe we need to put some of those back. Some of our waterways are polluted. How do we improve those? And agriculture can be actually the solution to all those problems while growing high-quality food. But it might mean changing perhaps some of the ways we think about agriculture or the way it's been done over the last 100 years.
And how do you think, like, your approach to farming and agriculture has been shaped through do you take a different look over your farm as to what it was when you walked in 16 odd years ago?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because our farm used to be part of a bigger property. And so it's very clear where our boundary is, the change in management over 16 years. And so what we do is we try to just come up, we're not very good farmers. We only have 70 acres. About 40 acres 40% of that we decided was for wildlife. The creek was getting eroded, so I fenced that off. We had some bush areas that's like, well, I might as well just fence them off and let wildlife have them. So they have these corridors run through. But we still produce 10,000 meals a year. And then we sort of thought, well, we better check that the land that we're using isn't improving. So we're measuring soil carbon and other soil measurements. But the beautiful thing is we actually see that compared to the neighbour's property, which was until this property only 12 years ago, same ownership for nearly 200 years, is the difference in what grows, like the species, in terms of pasture and some of the woodier plants, and the how it dries off, like how resilient it is. So we see our land dry off brown off in summer. Every year it'll brown off. But we used to be 4 days later because we slowed down the hill. Now it's about 6 weeks later. And it's like, I'm no genius. Like, I'll be honest, I'm a Gumby, new farmer. Like, there's a lot of stuff we don't know. But just using some ideas that we picked up along the way and not being bound to a tradition. I guess we didn't have to do what my mother and father or, grandma and grandpa did. We could just come up with new ideas and try them. And look how, in some of our paddocks, the carbon's gone up by 50% in 12 years. In the garden, it's sort of more than triple, but that's with a lot of inputs. But we're seeing this resilience, which is really quite beautiful. And we're seeing bird life come back that we didn't have 12 years ago. And all while growing, as I say, 10,000 meals a year, which is pretty good.
I'm really interested in that language, and you just used it twice. I was going to come back to it anyway. But 10,000 meals, why do you choose to talk like that?
Oh, so I use that because I think people don't, when I'm trying to communicate how much we grow on the farm, how do I measure that? Like, it's really hard to measure. We grow lots of different things. We have to grow up to 30 different annual vegetables. We might have 20 species of perennials. So the fruit, nuts, and some of the vegetables, like the artichokes and asparagus and stuff. And so we grow all this stuff. We have pigs that are fattened, sometimes using it's the skim milk from the cows that I milk, and we have dairy cattle and beef cattle and goats and all that kind of stuff. And we've had chooks and ducks and all of that and geese on the farm. But people don't really. How do you measure that? So I think it's really easy for people to see a plate of food and go, oh, there's a plate of food, times that by 10,000. That's actually how much food we produce. And it's not like some people produce a lot of wheat and they can tell you how many, millions of loaves or whatever. But these are like complete meals. So starch, protein, leafy greens, vegetables, all that sort of stuff. And it's quite a nice way to look at a property and go, what can it produce? Because that's what humans eat is meals, not carbohydrate or protein or, other ways of measuring it.
Yeah. And I think it's so interesting because talking that way, one, it makes sense to a consumer, but exactly as you say there, like we're hardly ever consuming just a protein or just a piece of horticulture, whatever it might be, unless it's, and when I say horticulture, a banana or an apple, absolutely, but you don't just eat one potato. It's normally part of something.
Yeah.
And I think my take as an industry, we talk about our individual kind of silos about cows, sheep, pig, whatever, but we very rarely talk about what the consumer's doing. And that's what I love about how you framed it then.
Yeah. And for me, it worked. It was a few years ago now. And I went, how do we work this out? Like, what does that look like? Because I can talk about, what we take off, and it doesn't, the numbers look relatively small, 40 pigs a year or, whatever, 3-4 head of cattle or whatever. And, the I can't remember the number of litres of milk. It doesn't look particularly interesting. But when you say, no, this is how many times we can feed a person, then you go, oh, okay, that's measurable. That means something. And I think that's sometimes as in agriculture, we forget because, you're dealing with, a certain volume, certain tons of this or a certain head of that. And that doesn't really mean anything to your end consumer. They don't know what, 50 head of cattle, sent off to the abattoir actually looks like on the plate or on the table.
Yeah. You talked at the very beginning about how, it was the greedy evolution of you thought you wanted to eat better, so you'd become a chef. But talk to me on that farming side. When did agriculture and especially the farming side really come into your life?
So about 16 years ago, I was living in Sydney and I was eating in really good restaurants. And I was like, they were telling me, oh, this restaurant's got some of the best produce in Australia and you're eating in the best restaurant in Australia and this kind of thing. And I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. And I went to someone's house and he was growing some lettuce in his backyard for a couple of little smaller restaurants. And I was eating this lettuce and this guy, he was undressed and it was better tasting with no lemon or vinegar or oil. It was better tasting than this restaurant, which was where the salad was costing like $12 or something. This is 20 something years ago. And I was like, wow, hang on, this guy's just grown something that's better than in the best restaurant. So, why does something taste better than others? And so as a chef, I was interested in flavour. So what drives flavour? There's obviously season, there's variety, there's all sorts of things. But a lot of it has to do with the grower. And so it was like, so if you can take more care of your land, you're going to get something that tastes a bit better. So I met all these growers who were doing really interesting stuff. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be great to grow something? I'd never grown much in my life. Like I had a community garden plot in Sydney. It was It was in a churchyard, like a former churchyard, and mine was about the size of a grave. And I can tell you a lot of things got there, right? I wasn't very good at growing, but I was like, oh, wouldn't it be great? And I'd had chooks growing up, so I knew the taste of a proper egg. And I thought, well, I'd like to go and do that. So I moved to Tassie, and then I realised I could buy a little farm, and we just started growing food for ourselves. Essentially, we were dumb, and we overgrazed and we damaged it. And we went, we need to move all the animals off somewhere else. So we bought a bigger property and we commuted for 5 years. And we grew enough food that we were like, oh, we need to do a market. We need to do a festival. We need to do big, long lunches. So then we went, oh, okay, so we've got enough food. And we love eating the local stuff and that flavour of place, that sense of place. And we thought, well, wouldn't it be great to sort of take that idea of what we put on the plate every day and expand that? So we actually had a restaurant that went for 7.5 years or something, where we would grow all the food and everything, pretty much 95% of what was on the plate came from within our fence line. It was that sort of paddock to plate. We were more like soil to stomach. It was, or paddock to plate, back to paddock, because, like whatever was left was back in, through the pigs, through the, chooks or whatever, and back in, or through the compost of the worms. So it was that idea of, what can we grow? What works here? And how would that look? And can you give it to someone else? And because we're small scale and growing a variety of things, that meant also that there was an income stream, because the inefficiencies of milking one or two is the reason why there's not many 1 or 2 cow dairies in Australia, is because it's not very efficient. So our inefficiencies were paid for by having the ability to sell it retail.
And setting up in the Huon Valley, did you decide that was somewhere you really wanted to live?
Yeah, the Huon Valley, so that's south of Hobart. It's about 45 minutes south of Hobart. Historically, it was actually a bit poor for a while. It was a really big apple growing region, but in the 70s, the bottom dropped out of the market, and it was quite a poor area, and a lot of hippies moved in. But what it had, because of its poverty and isolation, when I wanted to milk a cow, right, I of course I bought the cow first before I thought about it, and then I went to the local Mitre 10, and I'm chatting to a guy. He's like 19 years old, and I'm like, okay, I've got to milk this cow, and so I need a halter, and I need to. She's been milked before, but I need to like clip her onto something. And he goes, oh yeah, I've milked a cow growing up, and I was like, not many 19-year-olds would have hand milked a cow in Yass, which was the closest country town to where I grew up. And so then I tapped, so Elsie up the road, she's milking 3 cows, so I can go up and ask her about how not to get kicked. Marty doesn't make prosciutto, but he used to run the abattoir, knows how to kill a pig, and he makes salt pork, or ham, he calls it, which is essentially prosciutto, but in Tasmanian talk. It's a ham. It's a salted leg of pork that hangs outside under the south side of your house. So everyone had this connection to soil and to growing. And so I moved to this place knowing that there was a bit of a culture of growing stuff, but then realised that actually there's more knowledge in the local nursing home than there is in the state library about growing food in that part of anywhere, but particularly that part of the world. And it's this beautiful thing. We tapped into this knowledge base of people who know how to rear and grow stuff.
Yeah, and I find that so interesting, because that piece around it's the lived experience, especially in agriculture. Like I was chatting to a mate the other day, and he was saying that he went and visited his grandpa in the nursing home, and his grandpa had gone for a look around and said, oh, this is the exact same as 1967, which is the worst year I've ever encountered. And it's just that lived experience that you can't find in a textbook. But I think it is as well, like to the progression of the industry as well. It's so important to grab that knowledge and understand how things have been done to then be able to inform change so it can be guided rationally into the future.
Yeah, because there's a lot of things that are good in theory, like a good idea, that may not relate to your patch of the world. And so every corner of Australia, like every patch of the Huon Valley, I watch it rain, 500 metres from me and not rain on me, because we have these like terribly small microclimates. And there's a vineyard just down the road about 600 metres away. They never get a frost. We just had like 7 frosts in a row. So every patch of it, my world is different. Every patch of Australia is different. So what's going to work somewhere, it needs to be informed by that lived experience. So yes, there were certain things that we don't do anymore, or we've changed, and that's going to be constant. There's always going to be change in agriculture, like there's in everything. But there's a lot of wisdom that we need to tap into from that experience.
Yeah, I think it was Barack Obama in one of his presidential speeches years ago, nothing to do with agriculture, but he talked about harnessing the wisdom of generations that have gone by and the energy and enthusiasm of the generation coming through. And I think that's a really good metaphor for ag.
Yeah, and it is. It's I know we don't come from farming families, and so I speak to lots of people, and they're like, "Oh God, like granddad," or my mum, she's telling me this about the farm, and it can be hard. I think sometimes when you're, you there's a lot of history and baggage attached to that, but if you can separate, I guess, some of that, like, oh yeah, there's expectations, and there's, they're going to be looking at what you do and maybe disapproving or maybe approving, doesn't really matter. But just tapping into the wiseness of what they've seen, what they can tell you that's going to help you on your stewardship of that patch of land.
I'd love to know, like, at what stage did you identify yourself as a farmer? Did it take a little bit of time to wear the badge?
Yeah, and I don't know. I think, what I think it was. It was only a few years ago, because someone said to me, he said, "Oh, how can you call yourself a farmer?" And I was like I'd been out labouring, doing fencing, and I had a tusk injury to my ankle from a pig, and I had all this stuff that was going on, and I was like, well, what do I do all day? For about 45 hours a week, I'm out physically labouring, working on the farm. And I said, well, what do you do? And they sat in a tractor. I said, well, what's that? Is that farming? Yeah. Or is me physically moving, everything, like physically moving the pig shelters, moving the fences, rotating the pigs, rotating the goats, rotating the cows, hand milking the cow, whatever it might be. Is that farming? I was like, well, mine's just as much farming as theirs is. And it was quite interesting. It does, and I was this sort of like, and we still get it sometimes, that big farmers go, oh, well, small farmers aren't farms. And small farmers are like, oh, big farms are just like, that's not really farming. That's just sitting there with your GPS, running the tractor. Well, they're all farms. They're just different ways of producing food. And I think we need to value all of that, because they're all doing something. We're doing a wheat trial on our property at the moment. I can tell you it's expensive bird food, because no one's ever grown wheat, in the paddocks. It's not arable land. So, we need places who are doing that sort of stuff and can do it at scale and do it at a price that people can afford. But that doesn't mean that what we do is necessarily lesser, the small farms around us. Because where we live, just for your listeners, it's the most densely populated rural area in Australia. So there's more people live on small farms in south of Hobart, where we are, than there is anywhere else in Australia. So there's lots of people with small patches of land. And that's by geography that it's all quite hard. There's a creek, there's a road, there's, it's very rolling hills, there's bush. So there's lots of small areas that aren't suited to machinery, that aren't suited to big scale ag. And the only way to make it work is to do small scale ag. And that makes sense there, but it doesn't necessarily make sense at Moree.
No, not at all. A question I had written down, which is kind of the perfect time to ask it. Like, in your time in both the food industry and ag industry, like, what have you seen change? What changes have you noticed in and around food?
I think the big change has been, for the first few years, like I'm 58, so I've seen a few things. It's 40 years since I started in a kitchen. So at first there was this, like, people didn't really know where food came from, and then it got even worse. People just kind of forgot where food came from, and then there was this kind of like, whoa, hang on, what's going on? Do we trust what's being done on farms? How's that happening? And then there became this whole interest about 20 years ago where people are saying, oh, so where does food come from? Like, how do we tap into that? So that's when you sort of saw, like, more of the farmers markets, and there was more, people were watching Landline who who didn't grow food. And yes, there's still a lot of people disconnected, but I think there's been this whole movement of people saying, oh, actually, this is, this is part of the system. So we need to sort of understand what's happening in ag, because that determines what happens in our cafes and restaurants or on my dinner table for my family.
Yeah. And I found it so interesting. It was only last year. I think for me, it's kind of like the more you know, and I'm sure it's probably similar for you, but the more you know, the more you see, the more complex you understand ag is. And so, like, for me, I was like, oh, the reason why we don't all farm free range, regeneratively, whatever, is because it comes at a price point. So it's this, like, constantly swaying, like, board, really, or not jigsaw. What am I? Seesaw.
Seesaw, yeah.
Constantly swaying seesaw between, well, what are the farming practices that are carrying kind of the way consumers consume food, and then also too, well, how are the way that consumers are either wanting food at a certain price, at a certain convenience, at a certain, I guess, style, that's then influencing the way we farm as well.
Yeah, and it's what's the farmer good at? You know, I've got friends who are utterly brilliant growers, but you wouldn't put them in a farmer's market. Like, they'd frighten everybody away. Like, there's no way they'd be able to hand sell their product. So they're just really good at growing stuff. And so they should never be let near a customer, you know, pretty much. And they don't want to. That's not their thing. And then I've got other people who are, you know, really good at telling their story and really want to be out there, you know, doing that kind of thing. And so you know, what is your thing? And that's the thing about it. You know, for me, it would be a nightmare to be in a tractor, like going up and down rows, listening to audio books, and then, you know, having to weld gear. You know, like, that's not my thing, man. I'm just not into big machinery. That's not my thing. I know, and lots of farmers, that is their thing. They love the tech and the big machinery. And so it can be whatever you want. And so it's not just the consumer and or that we all need to be one thing. It's also that we're all different human beings who have to find our place in agriculture. And what I love about agriculture is it can be as mentally stimulating as you want, or as physically demanding as you want, or as, you know, emotionally drawing as you want to get into it. But it's what do you want to put into it and what you want to get out of it. And hopefully you can find your niche, because that's the trick, is to find the bit where you're happy and comfortable, not be doing something that makes you feel awful about your job or grim or goes against your philosophy.
Where it becomes a genuine passion.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's like, how many people get to really do that, and how many people get to, you know, essentially deal with this, you know, very simple things of sunlight, soil, air, and water, and create alchemy, create something of substance out of thin air. Like, it's quite a remarkable profession at its heart. But there are, I guess, jobs within it that can be a bit demeaning or demanding, or some people wouldn't like. And so how do you find your place in that miracle of producing food?
Yeah. Would you say, like, the way you define someone in agriculture has changed as well?
Yeah, it probably has. I'm not sure how I would have really clearly defined it before. But I think that there are so many different roles within agriculture. And so I was talking to someone the other day, and they said, "Oh, I'm not really the farmer." And I said, "Well, but you're out there holding the sheep when they're, you know, getting their feet trimmed, or you're out doing this, you're out doing that. Well, that's farming, isn't it?" And she was like, "No, well, I'm not really the farmer." So, well, you might not be like the farmer. You want to call yourself the farmer, but you're a farmer. And it's this weird sort of thing that we sometimes forget how we, you know, how do you define that? And that's like when this person said to me, "Well, you know, you're not really a farmer." Well, how do I define it? Well, I grow food. You know, is that a farmer? Well, it probably is. That's probably the simplest definition. Someone who grows food, and grows food not just for themselves, but to sell. I guess it would be defining yourself as a farmer.
Yeah. Let's talk about milk, because it's obviously why you're here. It's how we've crossed paths, which I'm incredibly fortunate for. So your latest book, Milk, The Truth, the Lies and the Unbelievable Story of the Original Superfood. It's a juicy topic. How did this conversation, this fascination come to be with milk?
So milk was born out of that whole thing of being interested in what I eat, and milk is transformative. So I was never a big glass of milk drinker when I was a kid, but what milk, you know, I loved making rice pudding or stuff when I was young, and then how it can be transformed into cheese and yogurt, and, you know, then you get your creams and your butter and, you know, ice cream and everything that milk becomes. And so as a chef, this is remarkable stuff. You know, it goes from liquid to solid, and, you know, and has these incredibly diverse flavors and textures. And then as a grower, you know, my job on the farm is to watch grass grow. I mean, it's literally what I do is try to grow as much grass as possible. So I literally watch grass grow, and then I move out grazing animals around. And so grass growing is, you know, is that simple thing, photosynthesis, you know, sucking carbon out of the air and making carbohydrate. But the carbohydrate's not digestible by us. So it's the most abundant carbohydrate on earth is cellulose in grass. Yet you and I can't digest it. No one human can. but we put it through a grazing animal and suddenly it becomes milk. Like what? So this is miracle upon miracle upon miracle. Photosynthesis, a plant making sugar out of thin air is a miracle. Plants make their own food out of photosynthesis. Like, wow. A ruminant turns that into milk. Like, how does that happen? Grass, cellulose, not that interesting. Suddenly can become like milk, and milk can become cheese. Like that, every step in that process blows my brain.
Yeah, it does. um, like, so it's also become, as we touched on, your coffee order or whatever it has, it's become so fashionable, and like your relationship with milk as a consumer apparently says so much about the person you are.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Yeah. So people seem to self-define through their milk choices, and I was a bit busy farming. I didn't realise this was happening till I was, in a cafe, and I ordered a flat white. And your question, well, how do you order your coffee? Flat white, and they're going, so oat milk, and I'm like, no, cow milk. And I felt really apologetic as an old white guy, going, oh yeah, sorry, cow's milk, And I was like, hang on, but that's what we always had. And milk was always this substance of, we always went, oh, it's pretty, this is really good for you and good food. And now it's sort of, become demonized. And I was like, wow, that's kind of odd, isn't it? How does that happen so quickly? And it hasn't happened to everybody, but it is happening to some extent. And then when you sort of read some of the headlines about, how they're going to, create milk without the cow and all that kind of stuff, in cell factories, where they breed up yeasts and stuff. And I was like, wow, this is super, super interesting. How are they going to do that? Because that whole transformation of grass into milk is quite incredible through a cow, and milk itself is so wonderfully complex. It's so full of stuff that is, it's not just food, it's communication between it's designed to communicate with the young of the animal that produces it. It's got, things that only feed the immune system of the animal, of the young animals, like this amazing stuff. How are we going to make that in a lab? So that may put me on this journey to, well, I need to unpack that, because for me, it was just something, when I was growing up, it was something white in the fridge that I poured on my, on my cornflakes. And now it's like, well, it's either revered or reviled. Yeah.
And I love that. And literally, like, you don't have to look too far from where we're recording here in Melbourne, but it's literally the architecture and design of cities have been really built around some of those old milk runs as well, and what was kind of practical in getting it to the consumer as well.
Yeah. So milk it's had this massive impact on us because we saw it as a really valuable food source. And so even there was a period of time when cities were being built and they were trying to get milk into the cities when they had no refrigeration. So they started in, New York's a really good example because it was a really big city and there's really good data from there. But they started having what they call swill dairies. So they would brew all the barley to make the beer and the whiskey, and then feed all of the spent grain to cows. But the cows lived in terrible conditions, and thousands and thousands of people died from the milk, but we still revered it so much. We still saw it as nutrient dense. So we're still like, oh, hang on, how do we do this? And so cities were trying to get milk in and out of cities when they had no capacity to keep the milk chilled. Like, imagine that. I lived without a fridge for a few months once, and my milk was, it went off within about 6 hours. It was amazing. And I was like, oh, fridges are cool, aren't they?
Yeah. Wouldn't have been much good for your coffee after that.
No, I could, and you could taste it straight away. I was like, oh, God, I gotta go buy milk again,
Yeah. And you went, well, I'm going to say wide as well. Like, you didn't just go, okay, what's the relationship between human and cow and the emerging? You looked at everything from seal pups. Like, it's fascinating how the environment to the animal to literally the physiology.
Yeah. So what I wanted to do, so I think one of the things, Ollie, that I like to do is I milk a cow, right? So, and I drink milk. So I've got my own biases. I've got my own, things. But I'm like, well, how do we reframe milk and we take it away from everyone's baggage and everyone's hang-ups and everyone's politics? I thought, well, what we need to do is pull back and say, what is milk? And it's quite hard to define because people will say there's cockroach milk and insect milk and flamingo milk and all sorts of stuff, So some of those meet the definition of milk. They're high in protein. They have sugars and fats. They have immune boosting compounds in there designed to feed their young. So how do we define milk? But let's say it's from a mammal. What lessons can we learn, I guess, about milk's wondrous role in life, in all life, so our lives, because we were all raised on milk. What lessons can we learn from that? And then how do we relate that to milk consumption of other animals once we become adults or weaned? Is that relevant? And what are the consequences of that biologically, environmentally? And what are the consequences, even more importantly, to some extent, of replacing those milks with substitutes like plant milks or cell factory milks? Yeah.
Do you find it difficult when it comes to, obviously you're coming, as you said, you're coming from your point of view of a bias, but to come at quite a neutral point of view to go, let's get the facts, let's get the information on the table and look at it quite objectively?
Yeah. No, I don't find it too hard. What's interesting, so this book has come out and people are saying, you're really pro-milk. Well, I did not start the book to be pro-milk. Okay. Right? That was never, I actually thought I would be way more interested in plant milks, and I thought I would be way more sitting on the fence. The only reason I came down way more in favour of milk is because the more you research about plant milks, the more you realise that they are shadows of the thing they are trying to replace. So they are, in essence, they are either doing you very little good, whereas milk can potentially do you lots of good, or they are doing you harm nutritionally. Do they replace it gastronomically? I don't think most of them taste that great. I don't know if you've ever eaten vegan cheese, but it ain't all that. So if you're vegan, great, you can have vegan cheese, but I'm not vegan, so I'm going to eat cheese. So it hasn't worked gastronomically. It's not working. It's not very valid nutritionally. So and this is the thing, someone said to me on a radio interview the other day, are you paid by big dairy? It's like, I don't care if you drink milk or not. It makes no difference to me. I don't think dairy's going away, but I think it maybe has to look at itself and say, are we looking after the cows in the way that is going to have social license? Are we looking after the environment in a way that will have social license? And that's all, that's what happens in every agricultural industry. But do we need to drink milk? No. But if you don't drink it, what are the repercussions? So, and that's where I sit is go, look, you're all, all your listeners are grown-ups. They can make up their own mind. They're not going to listen to some old bloke like me say, you should drink milk. I don't think you necessarily need to drink milk. But, Aboriginal Australia, 65,000 years of living culture with no milk apart from human breast milk when kids are young. So there's a culture that's lived for 65,000 years. America's 12,000 years without dairy, So we don't have to have it, but if we get rid of it, what do we replace it with? And so my view is don't get rid of it for the wrong reasons. You can choose not to have it, great. You can choose to have it, great. I don't really care. But make all those choices based on some valid information.
Mm. Talk to me, let's start inside the farm gate, because I'd like to pick off just a couple of chapters in the book that we can talk at a high level.
Yeah.
But in terms of inside the farm gate, the different ways we produce, what were some of the, I'll say the good, maybe the challenging, or maybe the indifferent things that you picked up as?
So with traditional cow dairy, I guess. Yeah. So what's really interesting about that is, I guess, how that's changed over the years. So what we've done is we've become much more efficient. Our cows are way more efficient than they used to be, say, 50, 70 years ago. So each cow isn't sort of producing 8 litres or 12 litres. It can produce, multiple times that, 40 litres, 50 litres a day. But is there a point at which that becomes a problem? And I think we're at the point now where what we're looking at is yield, very short life of a lot of dairy cows, a lot of lameness, and we're looking at them as a fermenter on legs. And I think that's no different than a cell factory, where we're not valuing, I guess, the life of the animal. And so I guess that's where things have changed a lot. So efficiency is great, lower emissions, more milk per cow, but there's a point at which all efficiency has to reconcile with biological limits. And I think we're probably at that point with dairy cows. I think there's certain ways that we are looking at intensifying dairy. They call it the Californian model. So the world's biggest dairy farms in China, it's got 100,000 cows, and they never go outside. They're all dead at about 3.5 years on average, which, an animal that would normally live 20 years. So any dairy farmers listening will know that, that's pretty young. That's not many, that's 2 lactations or 1.5 lactations in. So that's because of lameness, because they're expecting too much, because they're all shedded, they don't get to walk. And we also know that the milk from those cows that are kept inside is nutritionally not as beneficial to human health, potentially sometimes, less than beneficial to human health, some of the fats in there. So you still got some good proteins, but some of the fats become different because of when you feed a cow that's supposed to eat green leafy matter, you just feed it dried stuff and grain, you end up with a different composition of the fats in particular that isn't necessarily beneficial. And then, whatever you feed the cow, whether it's palm oil expeller, which is the waste product from making palm oil, that can have an impact on the composition of the milk. So essentially, when you drink milk, you are what your cow ate. So we've got to be, I guess, cognizant of making sure the cow's getting the good stuff, because then we who consume the dairy get the good stuff.
In terms of talk to me through that, because maybe just I don't quite understand it. You are what your cow ate in terms of So there's this interesting case in Canada. So in Montreal in Canada, they had this what they call Buttergate. This terrible thing that happened. So the butter was hard, right? These are the French-speaking Canadians, and they're going, "Oh my God, the butter's hard. Like it's not spreading like it used to, and the cappuccino is not frothing like it's supposed to. Like what's going on? The milk's weird." And it turns out there was more palmitic acid, which is a form of fatty acid, in dairy. And they traced it back to the dairy farms themselves, and the dairy farmers had started feeding palm oil expeller, which is essentially the crushed up meal of the palm nut. After you extract the oil, they would feed that to their dairy cows because it's a form of protein. You can tick the box on the wall saying, I'm giving my cows a certain amount of protein and a certain amount of fat. There's still some fat in there. But what we know is that fat is not necessarily as good for human health. And what we know is that it changes the texture and structure of the butter, so the butter becomes harder. So there's a very clear line. But we know what you want is a certain ratio of good fats to bad fats or less good fats. So omega-6 to omega-3 is a ratio that's used to it's just a very simple measure of certain fat components. And you want that ratio to be about 1:1, 2:1. So, but in heavily shedded animals fed a lot of grain, that can be 15:1. So it's a really bad ratio in terms of the composition of the fat that's in the milk that we then consume. So there's examples of how you feed the cow and how it changes the nutritional benefit or potential harm of the milk and dairy that we consume. Interesting. It's so fascinating.
Yeah, and it's super complicated. Like this stuff is really, really complicated. The chapter on fats, it barely scratches the surface because milk is the most complex lipid fat that we know of on Earth, right? So it's not just like a single fat in there. There's multiple fats, and they all interact. There's a fat called conjugated linoleic acid, right? So it's a weird name, but it's probably the main fat that we know that's an anti-cancer agent. And mostly you get it from ruminant dairy and a little bit from ruminant meat. And it's this wondrous thing. It's brilliant. It's utterly amazing, and it's in dairy. But that's just one of the thousands of different compositions that can be things that can make up the composition of the fat in milk. So it's a complicated topic, but what we do know is that if you feed an animal something a bit closer to what it's designed to eat, which is green leaf, fresh stuff, and less of the dry, high protein grain stuff and just straw and hay, the more green stuff you can give it, the better it is.
So I want to ask you, I've got a couple of chapters here, but is there any chapters that you love talking about or some that, really sit closely for you?
Yeah, I think the one I probably love is Don't Mind the Backwash. So that is, and this is where, so the book is trying to look at milks more broadly, So I look at human breast milk and I look at cow's milk as the main two, but I do introduce like Tasmanian devil milk and, other seal milk and stuff like that, because they're kind of interesting and they do give us an idea. But so what I love about that chapter, it's a lot about the proteins and things that go on in milk, but it's also the backwash is this idea that milk is not just a food it's not just nutrition. Milk actually has things that communicate, that allow our body to communicate differently, that change the way our DNA behaves. So this is the incredible thing about milk. So the backwash one, just to frame it, so you imagine a mother is breastfeeding her baby, and the baby might be a bit sick. Now, so a woman, a fully grown woman has a very mature immune system, a library of immune responses. The baby has a very undeveloped immune system, so it's very vulnerable. And so what can happen if that disease has that little baby has an illness, say a rotavirus, which is a tummy bug, the most common tummy bug, when it's feeding from the mother, after it stops feeding it, there's a vacuum and a little bit of its saliva goes back into the woman's breast. And it sounds kind of like freaky and creepy and weird, right? But what actually happens is the mother's body analyzes that saliva, and then and the mother's, body recognizes the rotavirus, says we need to create antibodies for the rotavirus, creates the antibodies and directs those antibodies to the breast milk. So the next time the baby has a feed, it's getting a dose of anti-rotavirus immunity direct from the mother. So this is a beautiful feedback loop. But when we look at milk, we're looking at things that's microRNA that affect how our DNA behaves. So milk has an impact on us from our very first sip and it can still be having an impact on us to our very last breath. Even if you're not drinking milk later in life, there's microRNA in the ends of your fingers, in your eyeballs, everywhere that have come from milk that are having an effect on how your DNA responds. So microRNA is like we used to think DNA genetics did everything, but it can be controlled by other things like microRNA, which is little fragments of proteins, essentially.
Oh God, it's mind-blowing.
It's mind-blowing. And this is only what we know now. A lot of this stuff has only come out the last 2-3 years. We're learning more and more all the time. And so when people say they can replace milk, I'm going, well, what are you going to replace? Because we don't even know what's in milk. Like we've spent billions of dollars in 150 years trying to replace human breast milk in baby formula. And the baby formula we create it keeps babies alive, but it doesn't even have. There are things called oligosaccharides in human breast milk, and they're the main sugar. They don't feed the baby at all. We used to think, why would you have sugar in breast milk that doesn't feed the baby? It feeds the baby's microbiome, the bacteria that live on the gut, the immune response of the baby. These sugars are there purely to feed the immune system of the baby. So we don't put those in formula. We don't put lactoferrin in formula, which is this miracle chemical that exists in really high proportions in breast milk, which is, look it up at home. Lactoferrin it's good for arthritis, for aging, for cancer. It's good. It's this amazing thing. But we know lactoferrin doesn't work as well. We're now making it using cells. It doesn't work as well unless it's in a form that's really easy to digest, which it is in milk, curiously enough. Not isolated in a factory and just added to your biscuits.
Huh. Talk to me about the chapter you wrote, Love Oat Milk, Good, Someone Better Love Bacon.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think this is the thing because I think a lot of people in ag, especially in animal ag, get a bit sick of being lectured by other people who don't understand how biological systems work and how, most of what's fed to livestock is a waste product. So it could be the straw from cutting barley or from growing barley or whatever, or wheat or whatever. So it's the bit that humans can't, won't, or don't eat. So the reason I wrote that one, so if you love oat milk, someone better love bacon. For every litre of oat milk, which is beloved by people who don't believe in animal agriculture because they're saying I'm having milk without, cruelty or whatever, but essentially by saying there's no animals involved. For every litre of oat milk, there's 200 grams of waste oats. So these are oats that they soak and steep and sort of take out, some of the nutrients, not all the nutrients. And anyone in agriculture will know, well, what do you do with like waste oats? Well, they get, the vast majority are fed to pigs. Some can be fed to livestock. Some is actually turned into biogas, but the majority is fed to pigs. And I wrote that because I think people who don't grow food have this sort of, oh, it's all happy valley, happy farm. Oh, nothing ever gets hurt because I'm having oats. So, the best use of those oats was not to make milk. The best use of those oats was for a human to eat them, right? That is nutritionally, environmentally the best use of the oats. The second best use of the oats, if you're going to make the milk, is to find a human to eat them. It's very hard to find. There's a lot of waste oats. And the third best use is to feed them to livestock. And that's what they do because that makes sense from a farming point of view. And that's why I wanted to write that chapter because that's about, okay, so you think you know agriculture. Well, you've got to understand how much waste product there will be from your other, almonds, like 89% of the almond is not used even in the almond milk. And when the almond milk's made, it's only got 2% almonds in it. Like, there's a lot of waste from almond milk. So what is, that's used as bedding, it's used as feed for cattle, that's used for chickens. And so I want to write that just so that people have an idea that, look, animals aren't separated in the agricultural system. They're part of the agricultural system. And if the best use of the world's resources is to take stuff humans can't, don't, or won't eat, and if possible, put it into an animal. Now, is palm oil expeller good for dairy cows? I think probably not. But, is waste oats good for pigs? Probably.
You've touched on like the human side. The global trend is that milk consumption is declining. That's correct, isn't it?
No, the global trend is that milk consumption is increasing, but that's because China and places like that are drinking way more, and the subcontinent. So India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. So their population's going up, and so they're drinking lots of milk. China's milk consumption has gone up tenfold or something. But around Western nations, yes, it's dropping.
And it's dropping by about 15%.
15%, yeah.
And what is taking the place of that? Is it the alternative milks?
Yeah, well, I thought it would be. I thought it was going to be, almond milk, soy milk, oat milk, and, maybe a few of the hemp and rice milks and whatever. No, it turns out that a lot of that drop is, only about a quarter of the drop in milk consumption has been replaced by plant milks. And the other bit is soft drink and bottled water. And so it's an interesting thing because you go, oh, we take milk out of the diet. Yeah, okay, fair enough. You replace that with, Coca-Cola or Sprite or something, right? Well, you really, that's not necessarily a better change. Bottled water, well, that's the original con, isn't it? Right? Taking something that falls from the sky and charging more than you would for milk, and putting it in a plastic bottle and moving it around the world. So it's an interesting thing. At least it's not doing you any harm, the bottled water, I guess. It's just doing the environment harm. But so it's not like plant milks are taking over, despite what some people might tell you. It's growing, but from a tiny base.
So I guess in summary, I'd love to know, knowing what you know now with the book, why should someone who's never heard of you, Matthew, or the book Milk, why should someone go and purchase it? And what should they be getting curious about the next time they're asked what kind of milk they want?
Oh, look, I think it's the book is for anyone who's curious, because it is, my aim is not to get people to drink milk or drink less milk or more milk or whatever. But it's saying, well, hang on, this stuff is incredible. We're reliant on it. It's 3/4 of the world's population get a substantial part of their nutrition from dairy. It's really, really important gastronomically nutritionally for the planet. What are the consequences? What are the options? How does that look? And are we doing the best job, with the animals in our care, with the landscapes in our care? Should we drink it into the future? And they're all questions that I think are quite valid. I don't have the answers, but I think, if you're actually interested in where food comes from, if you're curious at all about dairy, then there's a lot of stuff in there that blew my mind and probably blow yours.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming in and having a chat about it. I've genuinely had my mind blown through some of the conversations, and I love that you've become an accidental advocate in a way, where you've started off researching with one way with your assumptions, and I think it's been really interesting to see just the position you've come into, being pro dairy and understanding and sharing the role that it plays, while also looking at what else is out there.
Yeah, thanks. What I wanted to do was just let people know that if you're going to get rid of dairy, you need to find a nutritional substitute, and so get rid of dairy at your peril and possibly the world's peril.
Yeah. One final question: what might be on the horizon? What would be the next thing that's making you curious about the food system and production ag?
Oh, so what I'm interested in, so one of the things I don't know about is plant biology. Okay. I'm fascinated in plant biology. And so every time I learn and I read about new stuff that we're learning about plants, it makes me realize how dumb humans are. Because, this idea that they, can count, that they can farm microbes around their roots and then, either ingest them and eat them or pass them onto their seeds as the microbiome for the next generation, or whether they can communicate underground or communicate through the air, and all this stuff that we assume that they're just sitting there and dumb. And you kind of go, oh no, there's amazing stuff going on, and we're totally reliant on them because we can't make sugars out of thin air. like they can with photosynthesis. So these wonderful things are happening all around us that we are totally reliant on, and we really, really don't understand. So I'm pretty excited about trying to learn something about plant biology. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And is there something that you'd love to throw up, maybe a question to our audience, that something that you're curious about or you'd love for people who are listening to reach out to you?
Oh, yeah. One of the things I'm interested in is, one of the things I really don't know about in plant biology is, how do we grow crops in areas that are very low in water in our brittle environments? Is it possible to grow? Is there research being done on cover crops that can feed the soil in the off season as opposed to just spraying it out? Is there a way to actually keep green living plants in the soil and still get a good harvest? Because I think that's one of these challenges. Because it's at the moment what we do is we'll just spray. A lot of places will just do a summer fallow and spray it out. But wouldn't it be great if we kept photosynthesizing, because that's how we're trapping carbon and sugars from the air and punching them underground? Is there a way is that research being done? I don't know.
There we go. We'll find out.
Thanks.
Thanks, mate. Cheers.